Hey everyone, this is the Rewriter writing in. For today's video, I want to review the latest installment of the Fast and Furious franchise, F9. In this review, I'll go over what I liked and didn't like, and the final score will be either done right or rewrite. Also, this is a spoiler review, so watch the movie first before watching this, or if you really don't care about spoilers, then continue watching. This is a franchise that has been going on for 20 years now, so things are bound to change. But have they changed for the worse or for the better? Let's dive into the review of Fast and Furious 9. First, let's start with the positives, the things that I actually liked. I really enjoyed all the sequences that showed Dom's past. The actor that they got to play young Dom was actually really good. He had all the nuances of Vin Diesel, making him a believable younger version. In fact, in some sequences, I actually preferred his acting to Vin's, as his words and actions carried around a necessary weight that let everyone know that he was the boss, the one in charge. He did a great job in this role, and I actually kind of want to see him in more flashbacks in the next Fast and Furious. I know for a fact they're going to make another one. This series is way too popular. I also liked that we got to see Dom's father and brother, showing their strained family dynamic due to their father's dangerous but flashy profession of being a race car driver. These flashbacks were the best part of the movie, though I feel that they should have shown these flashbacks way sooner in the franchise, preferably at the fourth movie, because this was the next Fast and Furious film that featured Dom in the forefront after the first film. Having these key flashbacks of the main character's past near the end of a massive, long-running franchise like this is kind of a strange way of doing things. Now, the other thing that I liked about this film was that most of the characters felt authentic to who they are. Roman and Tej are still a great comedic duo, and I enjoy the sequences with Dom and Letty. It's always fun to see these friends all reunite at the beginning of each of these films. It's usually pretty funny and enjoyable to watch. Additionally, some of the fan service here is pretty cool, from Dom working on his car like he normally does, to some characters from past entries in this series making an appearance, like Han and Sean from Tokyo Drift. However, we'll talk about these guys more later, and Shaw in the post-credits scene. However, these are practically the only positives I have of this film, because there was quite a lot I wasn't particularly fond of. To start, let's talk about the big draw to this film, Jacob Toretto, Dom's younger brother. His motivations and goals in this movie are all over the place, and it makes his character's actions confusing to try and follow. The basic premise surrounding him is that in the past, Jacob and Dom helped their father on the race course by being in the pit stop. However, after leaving the pit stop, the father is involved in a crash that causes his vehicle to explode, killing him. Events happen where Dom gets revenge on the driver of the other vehicle by killing him and eventually lands in prison, leaving Jacob alone. Jacob begins to street race to show that he isn't under Dom's shadow anymore, because apparently everyone thinks Jacob is a joke and that Dom is way better than him. However, in prison, Dom figures out that Jacob was the one who sabotaged their father's car. And when he is released 10 minutes later, again, not sure how this happens, seeing as how he just murdered someone, but okay, he confronts Jacob, challenging him to a street race where, if Jacob loses, he leaves forever, and if he wins, he can continue to race. Now, here's where I take a lot of issue with this past narrative. Why does Dom challenge him to a race? Why doesn't he just confront Jacob, demanding he tell him why he sabotaged the car, instead of this theatrical show where, in the end of the race, he still never finds out why Jacob killed their dad? I mean, what was the point of confronting Jacob anyway if you were never going to find out why he did what he did? I don't know. This just doesn't make any sense to me. But, as luck would have it, Jacob ends up landing gigs for Mr. Nobody, becoming this top-tier super spy that none of the crew knew about until Dom told them. How the events of these sequences led Jacob to become this super spy beat me. I guess Mr. Nobody was looking for some angsty teen with brother issues to become an agent of his. And speaking of Mr. Nobody, aside from the brief clip that we saw of him in the beginning of this movie, it never bothers to tell us what happened to him. Did he die? Is he being held captive somewhere? Or is he in hiding? the movie never decides to answer this, and funnily enough, even though these characters have been working with Mr. Nobody for years now, no one bothers to go and try to find him or look into where he could have gone. This kind of leads into another problem that I have with the changes made to this series. Why is everyone now a secret agent? What happened to them being thieves and street racers? You know, what this whole series was supposed to be about? Why they decided to turn these movies into Mission Impossible ripoffs is beyond my comprehension. I understand wanting to keep things fresh when you have a series that runs this long, but this movie goes so far out of its way to be ridiculous that it just doesn't make any sense anymore. This ridiculousness feeds into the carnage and mayhem that they cause in London. For being the quote-unquote good guys, they sure caused a lot of death and destruction with those magnets of theirs. Seriously, go watch the first movie. It's way better than this by a long shot.
Whoa! He's got one of those big shiny things with a lot of tubes and curly coils coming out of it, with a red doohickey and... Vin, he's got one of those fancy thingamajiggers.
That's the real deal. But it's not the car you drive. It's the driver who's driving the car that's doing the driving.
But anyway, let's get back to this riveting plot. Once Jacob does enough missions with Mr. Nobody, he decides to go rogue and wants to rule the world now using this device called Ares that basically puts everything under his control. This is a pretty dramatic change in motive, but does the movie ever explain why he would turn full Bond villain?
How about no?
I just don't understand why he feels the need to rule the world. What was the setup for this? That he just hated his brother for being cooler and a better racer than him, and this drove him to being a secret agent and eventually a terrorist? This is so far-fetched. Fast and Furious writers, please.
Stop it. Get some help.
Another thing that really bothers me about this whole situation is the fact that Dom has known about Jacob this whole time, but never felt to ever bring him up until 20 years later when he became relevant again. The fact that an important character tied in with the main protagonist is only brought up here and never alluded to throughout the entire franchise is a sign of bad writing and lazy storytelling. It becomes so clear that these newer movies are an afterthought and just being written on the spot, instead of being carefully crafted into the narrative in a convincing manner. To prove this, let's take two similar scenarios, the one found here and the one found in Uncharted 4 with Sam and Nate. In Uncharted 4, Nate, after being retired from the treasure hunting life and settling down with Elena, is reunited with his long-lost older brother, Sam. Through flashback sequences, we discover that Sam and Nate always sought out adventure and knew that their calling in life was to search out forbidden lands in hopes of great treasure. On one of their first adventures, they sought out the lost treasure of the pirate Henry Avery. On this adventure, Sam and Nate are imprisoned, which is part of the plan, to discover a clue about this treasure. When things go south, Nate and Sam attempt to leave the prison, but Sam is shot by the guards and falls to his presumed death. Now, years later, Sam is back, and Nate has so many questions for him. In this scenario, it makes sense that Nate never mentioned Sam in the previous games, as he had believed that he was dead, and mentioning him would have only spurred the years of anger and pain that were associated with Sam's death. And Nate wanted to continue his legacy, as in the beginning of the third game, there is another flashback of when Nate, now a little older than he was in the flashbacks of the fourth game, he's seen stealing from a museum on his own. The series of events between these two characters is believable and well thought out, and it makes the reveal of Nate having a brother be impactful and interesting for the overall narrative of Uncharted. Now, let's look at the other end of the spectrum. As I've already mentioned previously, the fact that Dom, fully knowing that Jacob is alive and well and out in the world, never thinks to let his friends and new family know that he has a brother is just ridiculous and out of character. You know, for someone who continually preaches the value of family, he sure is quick to cut off and excommunicate a blood relative of his due to generally unclear circumstances surrounding the car crash. It's only near the end of the movie do we find out that Jacob didn't really mean to kill his dad, that the father was intentionally throwing the race and used Jacob's help in the plan. The reason Jacob never told Dom was that he was keeping his promise to his father. Now, here's what I don't get. Why couldn't Jacob just tell Dom that it was an accident? I know he wanted to keep his father's secret, but when it's not that crucial of a secret to keep and it ends up tearing their family apart, why wouldn't he just be mature enough to do the right thing and just confess that it was all an accident? In the end, it makes this whole rivalry between them seem really childish, and that Jacob had a big temper tantrum and now wants to take it out on the whole world. And speaking of this, why have the last couple villains been so hell-bent on ruling the world? What happened to the crew stopping drug dealers and crime kingpins? Why is everything now turned up to 11, where the team now has to save the world on every mission? I don't understand why the stakes have to be so dramatically and downright comically high. But the worst part of Jacob's arc is at the end, when instead of telling Jacob that Cypher has joined their team and is helping them take over the world, Otto and Cypher decide to double-cross Jacob and try to have him killed. This quote-unquote plot twist is so terrible. Why could they not have all worked together? They could have pooled their collective quote-unquote talent together. This was all just a lazy cop-out way to get Jacob to become good and turn back on his evil ways. They could have done this turn so much better, done it in a way that was convincing and believable, not last minute and unplanned. Let's now examine the other villain of this story, Otto. This has to be one of the laziest, most boring villains the Fast and Furious franchise has ever had. To start, there is no clear reason as to why he became a criminal. In fact, there's no explanation on how he or his family became so wealthy. And from what I'm gathering, the only reason that he's embarking on this path of world domination and global terrorism is because he's so bored of all the fancy things that he has. Now he wants the world, and this is the last thing that he desires. This villain is so childish it's laughable. From his cheesy jokes to his awful Star Wars references and his general lack of a commanding presence. It's so clear that no one truly respects him, especially this guy. They just want their paycheck, it seems. They also thought to bring in Cypher again, but this time relegate her to the very background, who literally only does a couple very unimportant things in the movie. Veering off from this a little bit, let's talk about the other major draw to this movie, the return of Han. Bringing back a fan favorite character from the dead is a bold move that when done right can be an incredible plot twist. Can you guess how well F9 handled his return? So, how did they explain his return? Han is approached by, you guessed it, Mr. Nobody after leaving the team at the end of 6. On one of his missions, he's sent to retrieve Ares from this family's home, but it turns out that Jacob was on the same mission. This leads to Jacob and his team killing the parents, leaving a small girl behind, which prompts Han to take down a few of the agents before saving the girl. The revelation behind this girl and Han's return is that this girl's DNA is the key to unlocking Ares. Han has been keeping her safe and training her for when they do come for her. The stupid thing is that they have Jacob captured in their hideout, who overhears the whole conversation and now knows how to unlock Ares. Why couldn't they have just put Jacob in a more remote location instead of right next to all of them? Or just knock him out for a while or something? This all just feels super forced and uninteresting and not very organic. Now, while I don't feel like this particular plot is terrible, I feel like Han really didn't need to come back for this. Han just came back to spout out exposition on the plot, and then when his big job was done, he was relegated to just another side character that helps the team. This made his return feel really uneventful and not very impactful at all. He deserved a larger role if they were going to bring him back. In all honesty, I think they just brought him back to garner a bit of nostalgia for the old school fans that went and saw this movie. This didn't feel like a well-crafted plot twist, it was just another lazy character introduction. Also, by bringing back Han, you kind of negate the impact of Tokyo Drift and Furious 7, taking away all of the emotion and character building that those movies had. But I guess they don't really care about that. If they wanted Han to return, the whole movie should have been about that, not 5 minutes of it. In all, I didn't feel like this was a well-deserved return for Han. He honestly just should have stayed dead. It was way more impactful that way. Now, another character that I want to briefly touch on is Sean Boswell, the title character from Tokyo Drift. While he's nowhere near as good of a character as those like Dom and Brian, I can at least appreciate the role that he played in that movie. He took down the main crime leader and beat DK in that pretty epic drifting course, showing that he was the best street racer in Tokyo, eventually racing Dom at the end of the movie. So what bothers me about his inclusion in F9 is the way he's portrayed. How did the best street racer in Tokyo, the cool guy with the beautiful girl, end up becoming this super scrawny nerd who spends his days hanging out with other nerds, strapping jet engines to cars and watching them race planes until they blow up? I mean, what happened to this guy? Did something terrible happen in his life to turn him into this? He's like a completely different character now. I mean, I like that they added him in for fan service, but the way they handled him was awful. I actually ended up feeling pretty bad for the guy. Now, I also want to talk about Mia for a second. While it was cool to see her back and working with Letty on the mission to Tokyo, I just couldn't really see her doing this. I mean, she has a family at home, that's why they got out of the life in the first place. Now, I know that her brother Jacob is involved, and that's probably the justification that they used to bring her back in. However, Brian would have been the one to help Dom with all of this, not Mia. Mia would have helped for sure, but just not to this extent. Brian would have been there at Dom's side, especially now seeing as how Brian is the brother Dom wanted and not Jacob. This could have led to a really cool sequence where Jacob fights Brian, proving that he is the superior brother and that Brian was weak. This whole dynamic could have played into the entire film and would have been really interesting to see. Of course, I know that this wouldn't be possible without using CGI for Brian, and the whole situation is of course out of their control, but I just feel that this would have made more sense to the plot. Also, why is Mia such a good fighter? I understand she holds her own and knows how to do that, but she's like OP in this movie. She fights like Daredevil or something. I just don't feel like this is all that realistic, but oh well. And speaking of realistic, or the lack thereof, let's talk about the big elephant in the room, the space sequence. I just can't believe they actually did this. In the theater that I went to, whenever the scene changed back to them in space, the whole audience was laughing. Now, I'm not sure if this whole sequence was set up to just be one big joke, but if it wasn't, then this was just terrible. Out of all the incredibly cheesy moments that these movies have, this was by far the worst offender. When people say that these movies have nowhere else to go but space, they didn't mean to literally have a portion of this movie set in space. The levels of cringe here are just out of this world. Yes, pun intended. Honestly, even if this whole sequence wasn't meant to be a big joke, then it was all kind of pointless. They could have hacked the satellite from the station they were broadcasting it at. They didn't need to literally crash a car into it. I just really didn't like this sequence at all, and felt that they could have done any other scene instead of this, and it would have been much better. Finally, let's talk about the ending. Like I've said previously, Jacob's turn to be one of the good guys now was done so poorly that it makes this final sequence where they just forgive each other and go their separate ways unrealistic and forced. After Jacob talked this big talk for so long that he hated Dom and now wanted to rule the world, I guess, the fact that this simple betrayal from his team made him drastically overhaul his entire way of thinking is just way too far-fetched. Someone who's gone this far down the rabbit hole, so to speak, would not just drop everything and change who he is on a dime. This final sequence is just another misstep in this series of missteps that really drags this story down and these characters into the mud. Now, an argument that I've heard being made about these movies is that they're made for the explosive action and crazy set pieces, not the story. However, I strongly disagree with this, as the original movie had a great story, with interesting characters and a narrative that had exciting action scenes, but was more focused on telling a character-driven tale. It seems that the writers of these new Fast and Furious movies think that people could care less about the story, and that action and explosions reign supreme. If Fast and Furious 10 is truly the last movie in this franchise, I really hope that they do their best to end it all with a compelling, character-driven story that's emotional, while also having all the great action and jokes that we've come to expect. I hope that the villain is well thought out in terms of motivations, and that the series rides high on the last film, reminding moviegoers of the amazing potential that this series had. In all, while there are a couple things that I liked in this film, there were a lot of things that I thought could have been much better written and executed. The villains were terrible and the plot kinda didn't really make any sense. There were no real stakes, and the inclusion of fan favorite characters were portrayed in unsatisfying manners. The action itself, even for being the staple of this franchise, was a bit too over the top as well. So, my final stamp on this movie is rewrite. And that's my review. Thank you so much for watching. If you've seen it, what did you think of Fast and Furious 9? If you haven't seen it, are you still gonna watch it? Let me know all of this in the comments below. And stay tuned on the channel for the rewritten story of Fast and Furious 9. Leave a like on the video if you enjoyed, and subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. Thanks again, and this is the Rewriter, writing out.